It is Alpa Patel here with you until 10 p.m. tonight. Now to a story I've spent over a month researching. You may have caught it on BBC London TV News last week or an online article that I wrote for the BBC website. The headline, "Working from home has helped me be a better mum." Not me, a mother that I've been speaking to called Martha. The story was looking at the impact that working from home and hybrid working has on children. Now, I know you might be thinking that it's not always possible for everyone, and you may have seen some of the news headlines out there that several businesses and organisations have been asking staff back into the office for maybe 5 days a week. But my next guest has some really interesting advice, some insights on this and what the impact of flexible working can have on children. He contributed to my piece and I thought it would be great to get him back on to talk about this subject more in depth. He is Professor Sam Wass. He is a neuroscientist at the University of East London. He studies children's brain development and behaviour, and I'm grateful that he is on the show now. Hello, Professor Wass.
Hi, Alpa. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing?
Yeah, great, thanks. Great.
Good,
Nice to be
good.
here.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us what the research on this shows.
Well, I think the research on this, Alpa, is really quite clear, and it has been clear, for a long time before COVID, which is you get these really strong associations. If you interview parents, if you take any kind of objective measure of kind of how engaged the parent is with the child's outcomes, how often they pick up the child from school as opposed to coming home at kind of 6 o'clock in the evening. Firstly, very reliably shown that associates with better child academic outcomes. So those children tend to perform better kind of at their long-term exams with more parental engagement. But also you get really strong associations with children's long-term mental health outcomes. So, they're better able to cope with the emotional ups and downs that come from being at school if they've got parents kind of who are more engaged, who are at home with them, during those really crucial times of the weekday, which are those times between, 4 o'clock in the evening when they've just come home from school and kind of 6:30 when they're ready for bed.
So is it better if we can do the school run, the pick up, the drop off, be around a bit more throughout the working week?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing, this is something I struggle with myself. I've got quite a long commute and I do tend to work quite long hours. And it's something that I really find that, you get home at 6:30 in the evening and everybody's knackered. You're knackered. The children are knackered by then when they're just getting ready for bed. And, I work really, really hard, but it's really hard to get those conversations going. And if you catch them a couple of hours earlier in the afternoon, when they've just got in from school and they're fresh and they still have some energy, it's just so much easier to get those engaged conversations going where they're talking to about what's been happening in the day when it's really, really fresh. And what I think is really important, Alpa, is, the research really suggests that those conversations where they're telling you about stuff that's happened during the day really help them to process it. So, childhood is pretty savage. We're learning how to make friends and we don't know how to make friends, and we learn how to make friends by making mistakes. And the number of things that one child says to another kid that are really, really hurtful, often without realizing it. And I think the reason that these mental health outcome links are so strong is, this process of talking to your parent about something tough that happened to you during the course of the day, helps to build your long-term self-esteem, but it also helps you to gain, self-awareness about what it is that you're going through. So that's why I think these conversations earlier on in the afternoon are really, really important.
So, in short, do you believe flexible working arrangements can be or is better for children's mental well-being?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of kind of really strong evidence in favour of that, Alpa. I mean, obviously, the tough thing is a lot of this comes down to a resources question. Can you afford to, work a little bit earlier? Can you afford to, only work a few days a week, take Fridays off work, as a lot of parents do? And that is a really, really tough thing that obviously is a very limiting factor for a lot of families. The important thing, I think, is that a lot of studies have really specifically looked at this. So, the difference between the wealthy, high-income families and the less high-income families. And what it really strongly shows, the research on this, Alpa, is that if there is a way for a lower income family to find a way to make it work, to make a little bit of kind of sacrifice in terms of, how many presents you're buying for the kids, that type of stuff, it makes even more of a difference. So the protective factor of parental engagement on long-term outcomes is even stronger for lower income families. So the research is really clear here, Alpa. It's not how many expensive presents that you buy your kids that makes a difference. It's that face time, it's that one-on-one contact time during the times of the day when they've got their energy to have that really, really good engagement. So the research couldn't be clearer on that.
And we know that there are parents out there are people who are going to say, this is just not possible in my job. And so do you have any advice for them, those ones that are shift workers in hospitals, in GP surgeries, dentists, the security guards, the ones in retail and in hospitality? Do you have any advice for people who are doing very, very long hours and are aware that they need to be spending more time with their children to build bonds, but are struggling to do that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is really tough. As I was saying earlier, this is something that I struggle with. I have to work long hours in my work. I think the really important thing is, often it can feel like it's impossible to spend quality time with your children, but even if you have a few minutes a day, you can make that into quality time by sheer force of will. What I find often, Alpa, is, in the morning, when I'm hurrying to get my own stuff ready to go, to get on an early train to travel into work, or, in the evening when I've come home and I'm tired, it feels like I can't spend quality time with my children. And in fact, the limiting factor is, my own mind is so full of other stuff, what I've got to do during the day, or, the stuff that's been happening during the day, that I don't have space for my children. And if I really force myself just to say, okay, Sam, I know you're stressed about this, I know you're worried about this, but you're just going to force yourself to forget about that for 5 minutes and do that quality parenting of, clearing your own mind and seeing stuff from your children's point of view, wait for them to say something, wait for them to show what they're interested in, and just follow what they're interested with and sustain and help them to sustain it and help them to engage with it, and forget your own baggage for a second. That's what really, really makes a difference. And the other thing that I find, Alpa, is when I do force myself to do that, it really helps me to digest my own stuff that I've got going on in my head as too, just forcing myself to put it away for a second. So, you can do it. I know it's really, really hard, particularly when you're worried or you're in low mood or that type of thing, this, forgetting your own problems and trying to think what your child's interested in for a while. But if you can do it, it really makes a difference.
So we spoke a couple of weeks ago and you mentioned this in an interview. So I have actually been doing this with my children. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I've been sitting with my 3-year-old who wanted to play bunnies the other day. So I followed her lead and pretended to be a bunny and hopped around the kitchen. And my son was very into his sort of imaginary play with Lego robots. He's been watching a bit of Power Rangers. And I was surprised to feel so calm during this play. And I gotta say, it was hard to stop. I did get a bit carried away, but I was really, really beautifully surprised at how lovely it was to connect with my children on this level. So thank you for that advice. And what I was going to ask was that, in the South Asian community, and I know this from my own parents, they were immigrants that moved here. They ran businesses 70 hours, 80 hours a week. And that did mean estrangement from their children because of what they deemed to be necessary financial survival. And there are a lot of these parents out there, particularly in London, because London's a tough place, right? Rents are high, mortgages are high, childcare is high. The battle is real.
Yeah, definitely. And, and finding the time to kind of have that thing is really, really important. But I mean, I think this is an area, Alpa, where, I really don't think the evidence could be much clearer that, obviously the long-term kind of survival and the long-term financial resources of the family make a big difference to your children. But that's not the only thing. This is the key, that it's about finding the right balance. And, a lot of parents, and completely justifiably say, I don't want to just be a parent. I don't want to spend all my time, jumping around the living room pretending to be a bunny with my children. I want to be a grown-up too. I want to have these long-term aims. And that's absolutely justified. And that's also very evidence-based, that this makes a difference to your children. But it's just, you can't go too far one extreme. It's finding the balance between the, long-term aims, putting the food on the table, ensuring the child has the financial resources to do what they want in their life, but also finding those moments of connections. And, if you can find that balance, that is really what the evidence shows is the secret to happiness. You can definitely fall too far in both directions.
I also think, and thank you for bringing this to our attention, that it's so easy to not value this sort of play or connection with our children because we believe other things are a priority. It's easy to believe that in our societies, right? And to be distracted by our own needs. So I welcome what you're saying. I think a major thing with people in the South Asian community, not all, but some, and beyond, is that we weren't brought up this way, so we don't know this stuff. And so it's so valuable to hear what you're saying, and that it's based in research, that this works. And it's really important for the long-term relationship and bonds with our children. I just wondered what your thoughts were. Oh, I think we've lost Sam, Professor Sam was, and that little noise definitely was. Unfortunately, we've lost the connection. We'll try and get him back, but it is such an interesting discussion that we're having here this evening about, what the impact of what if a parent is able to be around a bit more during the working week, the connection we can have with our children. Sam, what I was saying was that a lot of us were not able to be parented in this way. So because our parents are immigrants, so they worked very long hours. So what else can you tell us that can really bring huge benefits to the bonds we have with the long-term bonds and relationships we have with our children?
Yeah, I guess another thing that relates to this, Alpa, is this idea of not always being the strong one for your children, but having that, being able to show that the fun side and the silly side as well. And this is something that so many parents said to me. They found it really, really hard, particularly during COVID. It really woke it up during COVID, as we were thinking about with that article, this idea that, I'm there with my children all the time and I'm having to put on so many different hats. I'm having to be the one who's getting them to do the schoolwork. I'm having to be the bread earner. And then I'm having to be the playmate at the same time. And, that definitely is something that a lot of families really struggle with, and you get stuck in one role. But again, it's this idea of, if you spend too long in one role, then you start to kind of lose appreciation of that role, and you can find it hard to shift from one role to another. And I think, again, there's a really strong evidence base that, you need to be able to be the authority figure. You need to be able to kind of earn your children's respect as the person who's the one who's saying, look, I'm able to set these long-term goals, and, I can teach you how to learn and stick to these long-term goals, because that's a really, really important part of life too. But if you don't have any fun along the way, there's no point. And it can be really, really tough for your mental health as well. So, being able to shift from being the strong one, being the authority figure, through to being the fun one, and then back again, it's a really, really important example to be setting to your children, I think.
And talk to us about reading, because you've done some very good research into why reading to your kids is really important, whether it be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Yeah, so we do a lot of research doing this. So we do a lot of kind of measuring kind of stress levels in children's bodies at the same time as measuring stress levels in their parents' bodies while they're being read to, and also measuring the brain activity in the parent and the child while they're being read to. And I think what's really important about child-led reading is, it's back to what I was talking about earlier. You think of it as quite an activity because it's the adult who's kind of telling the story to the child. But in fact, if you measure, as we've been doing, what's actually happening, you find that what's really, really important and special about reading to children is that it's in fact a very child-led activity. So the child is setting the pace from what's being read by where they're looking, where they're showing interest, if they would turn back to a page, and sometimes go back in the story as well as forwards. And the parent is continually adjusting what they're doing, kind of depending on the child's interest. And I think this is at the key of what's really special about kind of shared reading, which is it's not just about the child's language outcomes. There's plenty of evidence that, it's really helps the children's language and literacy to be read to, but it's also important about kind of relationship building at the same time. And that's all about this idea that you're just experiencing stories at the same time as each other. So synchrony, that's what we study, whether you're breathing at the same time, whether you're experiencing these kind of little kind of emotional ups and downs at the same time and thinking about the same thing at the same time. And all of those things are really proven to help build a parent-child relationship kind of quality. Just experiencing the same thing, being in the same state at the same time, helps to build kind of mutual understanding and to strengthen relationships. So that's one, I think less appreciated reason why, doing that shared parent-child reading is such an important thing.
Are you talking about just young children here, or can this all be applied to older children as well? Given the debates around things like adolescence, the Netflix drama, and also the mental health issues with young people, teenagers. Are there any bits of advice you could give to parents who have older children?
Yeah, I think it's actually exactly the same thing applies. This idea of kind of shared experience is really, really important. I know a lot of parents continue to read to their children way, way past the age where the children can read perfectly fluently by themselves. For that very reason that, just experiencing the same thing at the same time as someone else, helps to build mutual understanding. It gives you a shared kind of frame of reference to talk about. Often if there's a, emotionally tricky something that you kind of experience in a book, and then you're experiencing something in the real life that's quite similar to that, it gives you a shared reference. Or do you remember when that happened in the book, and how they coped with that? Well, maybe that's something we can think about in our real world. But there's exactly similarly a lot of evidence for shared TV viewing, so co-viewing TV between parents and children. We all tend to do it as parents that, it's impossible not to, that you use your TV for the just give me a break time when I'm going to cook dinner, or I'm going to clear away dinner, or tidy the house and that type of thing. But there's really good evidence that sitting and watching telly together with your children has beneficial effects for exactly that same reason, that it's experiencing the same things, it's giving you kind of common frames of reference. So I think for teenagerhood, I think that's the really important thing. The more you can go with them in their journeys into these new things that they're exploring and these new things that they're discovering, the more you can stay with them and be interested in what they're interested in, the easier all of these things become. But I know it's a real struggle, because so much about teenagehood is about, they're seeking out stuff that's very different to what you're interested in. They want to, do that as part of their own kind of discovering their own self-identity. And they can sometimes be quite resistant if you try to get interested in that too. But, I think that's a really, really important thing. If you can find a way to keep those common interests going, then I really think it makes a difference.
And what about the thought that with younger children you can walk them to and from school, but there is a thought that children are too mollycoddled, and actually they need to be walking back and forth to school a bit more. They need a bit more independence. How is that balanced with the connection with children and hearing about their day?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, Alpa. I think that really is a question that, I think the evidence on that is it really depends a lot on the different type of child and the different type of the child's personality, and what they're particularly asking for at a particular time of day. And there's a lot of reasons why, a lot of parents view that kind of shared kind of, whether it's walking them to school or driving them to school if you live further away, can be quite a nice time to have conversations. So children often find direct eye contact quite tricky, quite challenging, quite overstimulating. And, if you're trying to have a tricky conversation with a child, then doing it when they're face to face and you've got your full attention directed at them can actually be quite off-putting to a lot of children. And, having something else to be looking at the same time can make it quite a good time to be having the kind of trickier conversations that you would struggle to otherwise. So in that way, it's good. But then obviously, when they get to that stage where they're asking for their own independence and they want to have their own independence and they want to have a bit more distance, that again is something that a lot of families struggle with. It's back to this idea that, a lot of families get into the kind of mindset that I'm the one who's setting the agenda, I'm the one who decides what you should be doing and when. And then when children start to say, okay, no, I want to have some control over, my daytime routine and that type of thing, that can be struggles. So I think it really is a question of, listening to your child, helping them to understand, what's good for them as well as good for you, and finding a right compromise between, what you enjoy and what they enjoy, and finding that common ground.
Talk to us about academic outcomes, because I noticed that you said, connecting with your children can help them there as well.
Yeah, definitely. So there's really good evidence that, sitting and, engaging with your children helps with their long-term academic outcomes. But again, that's something that varies a lot between kind of families, whether it's just a question of, establishing the routines. So one thing that is very, very strong evidence base is that, the more you can, so children really benefit from routines for lots of different reasons. I've researched kind of stress and how stress patterns develop. And, it's something that I really noticed during the school holidays, for example, that with my kids, and again, there's a lot of evidence that when they lose that routine, they lose that, the same thing happens at the same time every day, it absolutely messes with their own kind of body rhythms, which means that kind of their emotion regulation is all over the place because they don't have that kind of predictability. And it's the same thing kind of with home time, that if you can have that predictable routine, whether it's with you or with anybody, that they just do the same thing at the same time, then that really, really helps them to, their body kind of starts preparing for what they're about to do. Their blood will literally start pumping to their brain in anticipation of, the homework that's coming, that type of thing. So that can really help. But the other thing that varies a lot between families, obviously, is, how engaged you are kind of with the child's outcomes, whether you kind of enjoy it, whether you enjoy working together, whether you do manage to establish that as, some nice kind of common ground that is something that you do, and it is a comforting thing to sit and, help them with their homework, or whether they prefer to work more independently and you're just there, making sure that they've got the quiet space, that they've got the routine, that they've got the expectation. So there are lots of different ways of doing it. But, overall, it is the case that, the more the parent cares about the child, the better the child's academic outcomes. There's a very strong evidence base for that.
And you work in schools as well. Are schools sort of, how are schools doing when it comes to meeting the needs of today's children?
I mean, that's a good question, Alpa. I mean, so we work a lot with very early years. So, particularly my big emphasis is the 0 to 5 age range. So we're doing a lot at the moment with, schools who are having to set up nurseries for very young children who don't necessarily have experience of that because, the new government funded kind of childcare places. And one of the things I think that, we spent a lot of time presenting. I just was presenting this at the National Association of the Head Teachers quite recently, is in a lot of ways the way that we set up early years settings for children are actually quite kind of suboptimal. And I think we'll be doing it in a very different way in about 50 years' time. So we do a lot of research into children's brains and how they learn to concentrate in a kind of noisy setting. And, when I'm listening to one person talking to me in an environment where I can hear 20 different conversations going on at the same time, my adult brain is so good at tuning into what you're saying and blocking out all the background distracting noise that I don't even realize what a hard job it is that my brain's doing. But we know very well that children's brains find that type of thing much harder. So they find it much harder to blacken out distracting background noise. So that's one of the area where I think there's a lot going to change, because nowadays early years settings and a lot of early school settings are very, very noisy. There's always something going on, visual noise. There's a lot of bright lights, movement, colors, as well as auditory noise. So that's one thing I think that's, quite challenging for a lot of children at the moment. That's one of the reasons why I think some children really benefited from COVID, because they had that quieter environment. They had, working against a backdrop of silence, and they had kind of one person talking to them at once, which you rarely get in schools. So hopefully that's something that we can, learn that some children, all children benefit from, but some children especially so. So yeah, hopefully that's going to change. And I think, the school in 50 years' time is going to be much quieter, much less overstimulating for children, and much more kind of sensitive to the different needs of different children.
I remember you saying about the noise in canteens. Can you just tell us about how you've measured that?
Yeah, so we measured that. So we were doing a project actually on outdoor learning, and just taking a lesson that normally happens indoors into an outdoor setting. This isn't about forest schools and learning to make fires. This is about doing phonics outdoors. This is about doing maths outdoors. Simply because the noise doesn't bounce off the walls, it just goes up into the sky and disappears. So it's much easier for children to get a quieter space where they can focus. And one of the headmasters, actually a great headmaster at a local primary school close to us, said, "Oh, just out of interest, can you come and take this noise meter that we were using to take our measurements, take it into the school hall?" And it was 92 decibels, which is about the sound of a jumbo jet taking off overhead. That was the noise that they measured in the school hall. And he was really interested and wanted to use this. He was trying to persuade kind of his local authorities to get the funding to kind of bring some noise attenuation measures in. But there were so many reports from the teachers that the time after lunch, the first hour or so after lunch, you just get nothing from the children. It's basically dead time. And it's that just being in this hyper noisy environment just puts everyone in this very, very high stress state. There's loads of evidence that has this effect. And certainly the teachers completely agree that it was just really tough for the children to be learning after that kind of super noisy exposure. So this is something, you present it to teachers, and some teachers have got this, to me, quite mindless attitude that schools have always been like this. But, there really is a large evidence base now accumulating that, this isn't good. We find it tough as adults, but children's brains find it even tougher than us to process. So why are we exposing them to these hyper challenging situations that are really poorly designed for what their young developing brains need?
And you mentioned young developing brains. I mean, there's so much now about poor mental health amongst young teenagers, young people. Do you worry about our future generations and their mental well-being?
Yeah, I do, Alpa. And I think, we're just starting some research on this, looking kind of particularly unpredictable environments. So this is something that, really strongly came through from COVID. But again, there was lots of research on this before about, exactly what I was saying about kind of rhythms and routines, whether it's, picking your children up and then making that protected time for them to be doing their homework, and, just setting the structure that we set, as parents. And, children that don't have that, because their families kind of live more unpredictable lives, just how that affects their long-term development. And, as I say, we really research our stress system, so the chemical stress signaling in our body. And that is our stress systems are there to help us to adapt to change, to help us to adapt to unpredictable settings. And one of the things I think that, is really challenging for children and really kind of accentuates kind of divides between families is, if I grow up in an unpredictable setting, my stress levels are much, much higher. And it's much, much harder then over time for me to adapt to things. So I lose that ability to adapt because I'm constantly having to, adapt myself as a child. So that's one of the things I think is challenging. And, actually related to that, so we're just doing some research looking at screen time. So kind of fast, unpredictable screen content. And it's exactly the same thing that, I think a lot of screen content for very young children is designed to be produced at a pace that's too fast for their brains to track. So, I was talking about how children's brains get overwhelmed much more easily. And one of the other things that we know about their early brain development is they're much slower. So it takes them much longer to process something when kind of it comes at them. And a lot of our screen content isn't designed to take place at the pace that children's brains need, which is really, really slow paced. And when we're in this situation where stuff is coming at us unpredictably and my brain can't keep up with this fast-paced information, it also really affects our stress. So that's something I think that might be really, really important for future generations, that, we get used to this very high rate of information and, it really affects our stress, and we get used to being in this high alert, high vigilance, always on the lookout mode. And again, I think that's really important for our long-term mental health, that we get stuck in this state and, we start to seek it out. So if I'm used to being in this high stress, high alert mode, then I want to be in that mode. But it finds it very hard to relax, finds it very hard to have that downtime, find it very hard to concentrate on things. So yeah, I think that could be something really, really important to be understanding. And, again, hopefully, 50 years time, when we understand this much better, we'll design, our early life environments for our children very, very differently.
And which programs? So which programs do you think are better, like slower,
Hmm.
more considered? What do you think? Because I noticed this with my son is 6, my daughter's 3. The 6-year-old likes a lot of fighting and flashy stuff, and my 3-year-old is watching it as well. And I
Hmm.
have been more conscious of this and how hyper they get after
Hmm.
programs like that. And I just wondered if there are more appropriate programs.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, Alpa. So we actually had, I just was organizing this developmental neuroscience conference, and we got in lots of people who were kind of experts in early development from a variety of different sectors. We had a kind of child historian and a archaeologist and an English literacy person. And I got in Anne Wood, who was this TV producer, who was the originator of the Teletubbies, and Rosie and Jim back in the 70s, and In the Night Garden back in the 90s. And we had a really, really interesting kind of event with her where she was talking about, her own experience of designing, children TV content for very young children at a time when it was very breakthrough. She did a lot of the very first programs that were aimed at very young children. And we were talking about exactly this issue. So if you look at something like In the Night Garden, it's incredibly slow paced. So a single shot, so those moments in TV where you jump from viewing a scene from one perspective to viewing it from another. Your average shot length is about, we measured it in one of the papers, it's about 45 seconds or something like that in The Night Garden, whereas in most children's TV, it's kind of about a second. So you're jumping from one scene to another once a second or once every few seconds at least. And a lot of the shots are very big. So she shoots these big, wide open shots where you're viewing a scene from a long way away and there's just one person kind of walking against a very, very still backdrop. Again, the opposite of what you get nowadays, which is you get a lot of judgery camera movement and the camera's very close up to the person that they're taking pictures of. And all of this is, from her point of view, it's very well designed to be the type of stuff that's easy for children's brains to process. So it's slower, there's less happening at once, events are very spaced out and that type of thing. So I think that's something that sadly I think is kind of changing, and it is getting worse over time. We're used to this idea of trying to capture attention, and we're very scared. TV producers are very scared that children are going to look away, and they've just got this idea that if there's always something happening all of the time, then they're not going to look away. But in fact, the most important attention is what we call kind of comprehension-driven attention. So, if I'm understanding something and I'm engaging with it, then that is, also a driver of kind of attention. So, rather than going for what we call attention capture, which is, there's always something happening, like holding a bunch of keys in front of a young baby's face, and it's very jangly and they can't actually look away because they're looking at this movement. So that's kind of attention capture. But this other route to attention, which is comprehension driven attention, which is I'm sustained and engaged with what I look at, I think that's really, really important, and that's going in a lot of ways. So again, I'm optimistic person actually, and I hope that over time TV producers will realize that in fact we've probably gone too far that other way, and we're too worried about kind of cramming information into every millisecond of the TV content we make. And in fact, a better way to get engagement and to get children to develop characters that they really love and they really understand is to go the opposite extreme and slow things down. Think, okay, what is a child going to understand? How can I understand how their brains are different? How can I structure content so that, it's at a pacing that they can engage with? And that, I think, is a really long-standing route to properly memorable TV characters and stuff that they really love, for years and years.
So much of what you're saying is, I feel like it's so relevant to me as a grown-up as well. We watch so many videos on social media that are so fast paced, and I've noticed when I stop, it's almost as if I'm still like there's a lot of light in my brain, or I can't stop, I can't get my thoughts together. It's such an interesting subject area. I'm so grateful for your time. Just to recap, that if there are parents out there who are skeptical about work over time with the kids and that sort of thing, just give us the highlights. What is the important message around, not quantity but quality time with your children?
I think the most important message, Alpa, is there are resources issues for every family. If I'm doing a hard job, a professional job where I have shifts, and there are limits in how much time I can spend with children. It is challenging. Having good financial kind of fallback for a family is important too for a child's long-term outcomes. There's definitely making the resources available to children does make a difference. There's a really strong evidence base that that's true, but there's also an incredibly strong evidence base that parental engagement, particularly that child-led time where it's not about you saying to your child we have to do this next, then this happens, but that empty time where you can wait for a child to express an interest in something. So you've got that patience to say, okay, I'm just going to wait until you initiate, and then I'm going to go with you, and I'm going to follow you, and I'm going to help to sustain and engage you in what you're interested in already. That is, the most important driver of children's long-term learning. And similarly, if you wait and you leave space for them to talk to you about stuff that they're interested in or something tough that happened to them at school, you leave that space and you have the patience to wait for them to bring it up themselves, then that's also a really, really important driver of their long-term mental health. So you definitely need to have both worlds. You need to be there making the structure for your children, but also you need to be ready to listen and wait and respond.
I'm so grateful for your time, Professor Sam Wass, a neuroscientist at the University of East London. Thank you very much for your contribution this evening. Very, very grateful.